NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
My approach to the criminal justice system, right? And I know it's a little bit wordy, but my thoughts are, when I went to law school, I felt very stifled. I felt like it was a little bit soul crushing and boring. And I'm like, where is the class that teaches me how to be a lawyer like I see on TV? And the first case that really got me excited had the following fact pattern. The defendant was pulled over by 2 police officers. Gunfire erupted soon afterwards. One of the policemen was killed, and the defendant denied shooting the officer and claimed he was unsure of what happened because he was unconscious. So that defendant was Huey P Newton. And the reason why that case excited me was because, as somebody who's extremely political, who would identify as militant without shame, Huey P Newton was a hero. And I knew he didn't shoot anybody, and I knew that there was a history in the country of housing and jailing people of color and political prisoners. And so to be creative enough to say, well, you can't deny that he was shot, and now we have this whole new defense, the defense of unconsciousness, I thought that's how I want to practice law. Because the reality is that the system is stacked against people of color. And obviously, if you're here to learn about that, you're here acknowledging that. And so when it comes to children, and what could I say differently other than it's just as bad for kids as it is for adults, is how can we mitigate the racial trauma and the experiences of juveniles in our system? And I know that juvenile practice, in my office, it's a rotation, so most people do have at least 2 years of juvenile practice, but for those of you who do not practice, what I am saying also applies to our young adult clients from 18 to 25, because really what we're talking about is adolescent brain development, which I'll get more into, and the notion that you're not fully cooked until you're 25 years old. So hopefully some of this information will help you with judges and prosecutors in negotiating and understanding even those young adult clients. But this chart, it shows that in delinquency cases, in juvenile cases, we've had consistently lower detention rates and less filings over the last 15 years, right? Crime is down for juveniles, but despite that, racial disparity remains the same. So when you look at this chart and you see it kind of consistently going down, you still see Black or African American minors being detained at a much higher rate than white minors, and then at the very bottom is Asian minors. So that racial disparity in a one-day count, so just kind of looking at who is detained for one day in 2015, we have Latino youth as twice as likely as white youth to be detained, Native American youth 3 times as likely as white youth to be detained, and Black youth were more than 6 times as likely as white youth to be detained. So I will be interchangeably kind of saying, you know, children of color, but again, sadly, the research shows Black folks tend to still be the most affected. Now, this slide, it always kind of shocks me as many times as I've seen it. When does he stop being someone's baby? A large part of the issues in defending juvenile cases and dealing with children is perception, right? How are children of color viewed, and how is it that they are not seen as children, right? The studies show, research shows that law enforcement tend to view Black children as adults as early as 13 years old. Society in general overestimates the age of Black youth by more than 4.5 years. And children of color are also seen as less intelligent and overall more violent. So how does that play out when you are holding someone accountable for their actions and contemplating rehabilitation versus punishment? Well, you're looking at these children of color as adults. You are looking at this average age of like 13-year-old, 14, 15, and thinking they're at the age of maturity. And what's interesting about the chart on the right is it actually shows that for white youth, there is an underestimation. In other words, white youth are seen as younger than their actual age, less culpable, more deserving of a second chance. So this, comes out obviously post the murder of Trayvon Martin, the kind of conversation that one would have with a young black male versus a young white male. If you're Googling kind of the talk, this is one of the images that comes up. So we're telling our children, and I have a little boy, don't wear a hoodie, don't carry Skittles or iced tea, don't walk through a nice neighborhood, don't, and then, this long list of don'ts where you're telling a young white male, don't forget to floss, right? This is your biggest worry. I'm constantly, in terms of being a parent, trying to contemplate how do I raise my son to be bold, to know his rights, to be able to assert those rights if, and I say if hopefully, when I mean when, he has a confrontation with police without getting killed, right? How can he talk in a way that's different? So one of the areas where this comes into play, we've all kind of heard of the school to prison pipeline. I liked this image, with the pencils as the bars on a cell, right? Is because it starts very, very early. When you're thinking about what is the school to prison pipeline and what does that term actually mean? And it deals with the policies that are in place which start to remove children from their learning environment and set them up for failure because they have been suspended or expelled or are just removed from the classroom, even if it's just going to the principal's office. Studies show that Black males are the most suspended racial group starting in preschool. So the Equal Justice Initiative actually put out a document talking about the preschool to prison pipeline. And again, it's because of how they are viewed. Another image, this little boy is on a crate, as he's getting booked because children of color, Black and brown children are criminalized for normal childhood behavior, normal child behavior. And when I use the word normal, right, it's talking about cognitive behavior development, the notion that every child is testing boundaries as part of growing up, right? Every child is horsing around, playing around. But what happens when you have policies in school suspensions and in school discipline that allows for the implicit bias, which I won't define because we've heard that in several talks, of teachers and staff to have this discretionary way of disciplining. So in these charts, this is for 2010, you have Black first-time offenders were suspended at a higher rate than white first-time offenders for the same offenses. So cell phone possession, you have display of affection, you have disruptive behavior. And that one is really important because, again, what defines disruptive? What happens when someone passes a note in class or somebody is horsing around, even if it's physical play, and the teacher sees this student as more responsible, more aware of consequences, a higher tendency to be violent, and less intelligent, right? I want you out of my classroom. And this exclusionary discipline is that notion of getting rid of the, quote, bad kids so that the good kids have a better learning environment. But what does that mean for the child who is confused and who doesn't understand consequences and is engaging in impulsivity and risky behavior just by virtue of where they are in their brain development, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about. But here's the problem. Once students are suspended or expelled, they become 3 times more likely to have delinquency or criminal contact the following year. So again, that school to prison pipeline, just statistically, you are now removed from your school, You often, and I see it in juvenile practice, have a gap of you've been kicked out of school or you're suspended for 3 days, parents have to work. What are you doing for those 3 days, right? How likely are you to then be in contact with the police? Students who are arrested on campus are twice as likely to drop out. Now, once again, how are students arrested on campus beyond the obvious of calling the police in? So often, there are school police officers and other law enforcement personnel assigned to campuses at larger rates for high crime areas. High crime, again, being a code for poor neighborhoods, for neighborhoods more impacted by people of color, where they have people of color, and all of a sudden police and law enforcement become the main area or the main method of discipline. So where something would have been handled in-house and go to the principal's office, now you're sent to the school resource officer. And now, when you push someone, well, it's a battery. Now there's the possibility of a juvenile filing. Black students represent 31% of school-related arrests. So you see this, nice little path that Black boys and girls are being walked down. Students who appear in court because they have a delinquency citation are 4 times as likely to drop out. So we have all of these cyclical, interrelated statistics saying if you are removed from the classroom and you're told you shouldn't be there and you are ruining the learning environment, it's setting you up for future failure. Another one, it's kind of fuzzy. It says, I'd like to have this birthmark removed. And it's a target on the Black boy's chest. Nan was talking about our skin color being weaponized. And this quote says, when the color of your skin is seen as a weapon, you will never be seen as unarmed. Because just by virtue of that brown, of that Black, you're already a threat. So what have been the trends in juvenile law in terms of how we practice, right? 1967 was kind of our seminal case, People v. Galt, and that was the case that allowed for juvenile delinquency cases and for minors to be entitled to attorneys. And the reason behind that, and why it took so long, is this notion that the separation between juvenile practice and adult practice is that juvenile still pretends to be about rehabilitation. And because of that, and because that's the stated purpose, often we are left out, we being juvenile advocates, of the conversation when it comes to criminal justice reform and the need to have reforms implemented within the juvenile system, because the thought is, okay, so you might go to boot camp and get your case sealed, but at the end of the day, you're not looking at prison or you're not looking at some of the same consequences. One, very much untrue, because in California, it's the Department of Juvenile Justice, used to be called California Youth Authority, but it is baby prison. It is run by the California Department of Corrections. It is very much detention and very much seen as prison. So you have this 1967 case, which isn't that long ago, right? And you have the right to an attorney, and juvenile advocacy becomes even more significant. However, Black and brown children, once again, were not considered. They were already disproportionately represented, even in the 60s. And the rehabilitation or the mitigation, all of the programs, will go to this group home or receive this counseling or, community service. It was really designed for European immigrant children. And the thought was that, and the, quote says the Negro, that Negro children were not amenable to the treatment and it was a waste of resources. So let's focus our attention on white children. Now, it goes in waves. So then we get the late 80s through 90s, which we call the war on children. This is when that notion of the super predator comes out, the subhuman, amoral, feral children. Hillary Clinton got in a lot of trouble because she used the term, but she actually isn't the one who coined that phrasing. And when we're thinking about super predators, once again, who are the super predators, right? And how did the country respond to that? One of the major things is that youth were now everyone was looking for ways to try youth as adults. trying to assign more culpability to children. Every state, with the exception of Nebraska, I don't know if there's anyone here from Nebraska, but Nebraska is the only state that did not engage in this war on children and change laws to get children tried as adults. I don't know why. But the ways that they did that, one was lowering the age at which juveniles could be prosecuted as adults. We just had a very good law pass in California where now we are back to 16 being the minimum age for children being tried as adults. But for a while, it was as low as 14. During this time in the 80s and 90s, children as young as 8 and 10 years old were being arrested. Extending the types of crimes that trigger automatic adult prosecution, right? It's always unsettling, especially in New York. You hear stories like the Khalif Browder story, and it's like, why are these teenagers in Rikers? And why are they being tried as adults for these crimes that don't seem that serious? Giving prosecutors exclusive authority over who was tried as an adult, and limiting the discretion of juvenile judges. So in California, we had what was called direct file, meaning that the district attorney's office would look at a case, evaluate it, and just make the decision, this is so heinous that this child needs to be tried as an adult, and it never even went through any sort of evaluation or through a juvenile judge. So who would the super predators be? Again, before Prop 57, which is what changed that direct filing and only was passed in November of 2016, 90% of all direct files in California were youth of color. Youth of color are 5 times more likely than their white counterparts to be incarcerated or detained. And in 2013, another one of these like one-day snapshot evaluations, Latino youth were 61% more likely to be detained than white youth. And youth of color are 300 times, that is not a typo, more likely to be arrested for simple assault than white youth. And again, when you're talking simple assault, this is getting in a fight on campus. But now your campus has a school resource officer, has someone in law enforcement, and so you're getting arrested for it. Even if you're only charged with a misdemeanor, you now have this responsibility to be supervised for any amount of time up until you're 21 years old. You have to do counseling. Your parents have to do parenting. In California, you have to pay for children to be detained. You have to pay if they get removed and go to a group home. All of these responsibilities placed on children for what is cognitively normal behavior. The shift then started to kind of swing in the favor of juveniles and delinquency cases with several seminal cases. First one, 2005, Roper v. Simmons. This is the case that said that children can no longer receive the death penalty, right? What would seem like pretty obvious. It overturned the Stanford decision, which said that 16 and 17-year-olds could receive capital punishment. And the basis of all of these cases, as they progressively gave juveniles a little bit more, is this notion that children need to be seen as a separate class, right? That children's brains are different. Children still have a lot more ability to not just change, right? Anyone, obviously, as a public defender, I believe in redemption, and I believe that everyone is better than their worst act. But literally, the science of the adolescent brain is that connections and wires and synapses and stuff are actually forming. Pathways are still forming. And so children and the juvenile advocates that really pushed for these cases and got behind this argument look to behavioral scientists. They look to neurologists and brain scans to be able to articulate that children should be seen as a separate class. So you have no more death penalty. Then you go a step farther to no more LWOP for non-homicide cases. Then you go even a step farther to, you know what, there shouldn't even be an assumption of LWOP for homicide cases because you have to give an individualized evaluation to every child since they're now this different class. We know they move differently. And finally, in 2016, we move on to the notion that really no child should be getting LWOP or life without parole unless you can show permanent incorrigibility, which essentially means unless you can state that this child cannot be rehabilitated, that this child is not amenable to services that are going to aid in that rewiring and changing whatever the conduct was. So it's a lot of information. The adolescent brain, the reason why it's considered a second window of opportunity is because when we think of brain formation and we think of learning, you have this huge amount of development from ages 0 to 3. So that notion of your brain being where it's going to be, or 80% where it's going to be at 3 years old, is based on how it's forming. Then things slow down a little, but what happens is that there becomes this second wave of formation in the adolescent brain, which allows for rewiring, for changing. And of course, I'm using very non-scientific terminology. I'm a lawyer, I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a psychologist, but the basic understanding is, hey, teenagers are impulsive. Teenagers engage in risk. Teenagers are more susceptible to peer influence. And what's important is that this is very different from just that notion of they're not smart, right? It's not just kids are stupid, even though they behave that way. It's about how their brains are impacted. So one example is, consider a child who is going to a party, right? And you are that cool parent, and so you're not being unrealistic about what your child is going to engage in. So you tell your 17-year-old, your 16-year-old, listen, don't drive drunk. And the kid is like, Mom, I don't drink. I'm not, that's not even an issue. That's fine. Don't drive drunk. And in that setting of being at home, under no stress, without peers, without substances in your bloodstream, right? An intelligent child logically understands and intellectually understands that it would be a poor decision to drive drunk. But what does the CDC tell us happens at 1 a.m. when everybody is drunk? The kids decide who's the least drunk, proceed to drive, and best case scenario, make it home. But obviously that's how you get to all of these deaths by children who are drunk, teenagers, and they have the worst driving statistics and all of that. Now, what happened between that conversation at home and being at the party? All of those other influences. Heightened emotional distress. Let's say the parents of the people at the party came home and now everyone has to go, or the police arrived, or someone in your group says, oh no, I promised I'd be home by 12, my mom's gonna kill me. You have peer influences. You have your friends saying, well, you seem okay, you're walking, it's not far, you can get us home. You have the obvious of substances inside of you if you did have a drink, but all of this changes that prefrontal cortex, your executive functioning, your decision making, and you make a bad decision. In adolescence, the brain goes through, again, that period of accelerated development. And here's some of the better words. The pruning of unused pathways increases. It's similar to early childhood. It makes the brain more efficient, especially the part of the brain that supports attention, concentration, reasoning, and advanced thinking. Again, totally separate from you having a child who is in honors classes and a child who understands algebra. It's about your child making decisions and how is the child making decisions. Now, going back to my Huey P Newton story, and what I think is very interesting and something that I would hope to encourage and get all of you on board with, is a notion of racial trauma, which we're going to talk about. But one thing that's important and has been confirmed is trauma on brain development. When you think about trauma, and I believe that the next speaker, because I stole a glimpse at her slides over lunch, is going to get into some definitions of trauma and come from a better perspective. But trauma during adolescence disrupts the development of this part of the brain and the strengthening of the systems that allow the brain to effectively communicate with the other systems. And so that goes into increased risk-taking, impulsivity, substance abuse, and for our purposes, criminal activity. And when you're thinking about trauma and that definition of trauma, now, this was just a slide I pulled, it's colorful. I have no idea what it means other than something's happening, right? You see a brain that's got experiencing trauma. But what is trauma? And I know this is too many words. My plan was to animate it so we could go through each one. But the psychological, emotional response to an event or experience that is deeply disturbing. So when you think about trauma, it can range from those things like your parents getting a divorce. But more significantly for our purposes and for race discussions, what is the higher probability experience for children of color, especially poor children of color? And once you start putting all of these layers of living in a certain community that is over-policed, experiencing violence, right? You have traumatic occurrences happening constantly, and you get this complex trauma. And what happens is complex trauma happens repeatedly. It often results in direct harm to the individual. And some of the ways that it affects the brain and this exposure to chronic, prolonged, traumatic experiences, right? Dr. Ron Minagawa, who's a forensic psychologist that we use a lot in transfer cases, those are the cases in California, that's the terminology for when the DA is trying to try children as adults. He talks about children in Compton and having this experience where they have seen so much violence, where it is commonplace to have seen a friend be shot, a family member beaten by police, as child soldiers, right? Similar to that notion of, you know, how are these children capable of this stuff? It leads to attachment problems. It affects physical health. It affects emotional regulation, dissociation, cognitive ability, self-concept, self-esteem, behavioral control, right? These are all the ways that trauma just generally can affect the adolescent brain. But then we want to move into this notion of racial trauma, right? And what is important, and this is included in the materials, racial trauma is something that every single person of color in the United States has experienced. So does that mean automatically that we all are going to live criminal lives? No. Does it justify certain acts? No. It's more about mitigation and effective treatment and coupling that with the actual science of how children's brains are rewired by this constant trauma. And so having participated and being at this conference is very interesting. Of course, knowing my topic, the woman, Tyra Patterson, when she was talking about feeling dehumanized and saying, well, I talked how I talked and I didn't feel worthy and dropped out of school at 11 and no one came looking for me. And this low self-worth, right? That's a symptom of trauma. When you think about Drew saying, talking about hip hop and saying, these young people experience pain. And even though I'm not in his age bracket for young, this conference has been traumatic for me, right? As a Black woman, to hear these statistics over and over, to constantly see images of people who have been murdered by police, to know the statistics of detention rates, and to have that repeatedly beat into my head is traumatic. It's upsetting, okay? It is something that I carry with me. It is something that I have to debrief about and discuss. I have a version and a vision of this world that is different from a white counterpart. And it is also a version that can seem pessimistic, hypervigilant. It can seem frightening. And my mother, who lives in a bubble and is not Black, we've got to a point at this stage with me being, fully grown and I can talk back, where we can't have certain discussions because you don't understand. And I don't care that you love me. I don't care that I'm your first child and you love me as much as one human can love another. You don't understand what it is like for me and my experiences on a day-to-day basis, and you don't understand what I need to do to protect my Black children, even if necessary, from you and your implicit bias and your foolish comments and comments from other family members that are, you're different, right? You're not like the rest of them kind of thing. So what is racial trauma as a definition? Some people refer to it as race-based traumatic stress, but it stems from living in a country that deifies whiteness and demonizes people of color, right? It's all about that doll example. It's all about the notion that as a person of color, I am less than, I am less attractive than, I am less smart, less intelligent, I am more violent, I am more aggressive, and that is told to me subliminally, subconsciously, and outright my entire existence. And how is that going to affect me? Repeat exposure to racism or discrimination, racial harassment, racial violence, and or experiencing institutional racism. And the symptoms include anxiety, depression, hypervigilance to threat, low self-esteem, feelings of humiliation, poor concentration, irritability, and a lack of hopefulness for the future, right? So when, again, bringing it back to children, they don't have the words. They don't understand this notion of oppression necessarily. They know, yeah, when I walk into a store, somebody follows me. And they can even go a step further and say it's because I'm Black, or it's because I'm Mexican, or it's because I am Filipino, or whatever their experience is. But to take it all the way to knowing that there is trauma and seeking help, that's not going to happen. And so as defense attorneys and juvenile advocates or young adult advocates, we are often that first line of recognition to be able to speak to a child and say, all right, let me get you the best sort of help to deal with something that you don't even have the words to understand. So what is our role? First off, alliances, right? Conferences like this. Hats off to everyone who just saw a flyer and isn't coming for any specific speaker or because your friend is Nan and forced you to speak, right? For just recognizing that race and the law go so unfortunately hand in hand that you want to come and learn more. Talk to people, get on listservs, be engaged with others about what's going on in their respective states. Legislative relationships. We're often just in the courtroom, tireless soldiers who are responding to things instead of taking an active part in testifying at hearings and saying, no, this is not what happens in the courtroom, which goes into the next one, create policy. How often does a law come into place, like the bail one, the SB 10 and getting rid of cash bail is a good example where it's like, you know, this is a good idea, but as defense attorneys who work with judges and know my judge is just going to say someone's dangerous and detain them, we need to be part of writing and wording the policy. Collect data. Now, I know we're all busy and we may not be properly analyzing it. You know, I have a sociology background, so I like that part, but just jot down for 6 months. Every new case that you get, what's the race of the client? What's the age of the client? What are some of the experiences of the client? What's the offer by your prosecutor? Does the judge give you a better offer? Is your client detained, right? So that you can see these patterns and it's not just anecdotal and not just telling stories. We all know what happens, but we need to be able to prove it. Create the narrative, also say yes to the press. Right? These stories go out. I have a case right now, and there's all kinds of articles about my 16-year-old child who is charged with killing his son. He didn't kill his son in the best case scenario. When you look at the police report and you know the law, there is no murder there. But that's what's in the newspapers. And finally, make sure that racial trauma is acknowledged, right? Both when you interact with your clients as well as when you are trying to assist your juvenile clients or your young adult clients. If you are finding somebody therapy, if you're trying to offer up an alternative version or alternative sentence, and you're telling the judge that this is what your client needs, make sure that you have an expert who is appointed where you can say, how do you feel about race? If that expert says that doesn't play a part or that's not relevant, thank you for your time, and you move on. Talk to your clients about race. When is the first time they noticed their race? When is the first time that they felt proud of their race? Have they ever felt proud of their race? give a voice to their oppression so that you can communicate freely and bring it up. Bring it up to the judge, to the prosecutors, bring it up to anyone who will listen that, hey, this is a part of the necessary treatment. And the best way to achieve public safety, right, is to heal the person who is engaged in any sort of negative conduct. So let's make sure that we are prescribing healing that actually benefits children of color. Thank you.